What would even be the point of trying to get into comp when this is what you're up against?
How is anyone even supposed to catch up to something like this?
If things don't change, it is guaranteed comp dies.
Over the past 5 years, the competitive VR space has grown dramatically, going from an extremely small, niche online community to a much larger audience with many successful LAN events being held in recent time. But why does it feel like that growth hasn't stagnated? As players continue to get better and better, where does that leave new players doing catch-up today? In this video, we're going to discuss the recent stagnation in VR competitive games and the invisible timer that is secretly killing competitive VR. Before diving in, I think we should cover some important terminology that will be used throughout the video. The skill ceiling is the measure of potential peak performance in a given game. This is generally understood by how good a given player can be at a certain game, due to what the game lets you do. This limit may rise and fall depending on updates or what players discover about the game, and this is actively coveted by the competitively focused, whether that be fun or for profit. With that, you also have your theoretical skill ceiling, a maximum ability achievable by a given individual, dedicated by many variables such as age, natural skill, previous experience, and available playtime. Conversely, the skill floor is the minimum performance required to play something. The skill floor is at its lowest when it comes to single-player games, as these are often designed to be extremely approachable and customizable, pretty much fit for anyone to play. Certain games can demand a much higher skill floor for it to be enjoyable. A game might have a lot of mechanical depth, requiring the player to learn all the mechanics and the fundamentals of the game before being able to enjoy the whole experience. The issue arises within multiplayer games due to the fact that the skill floor is dictated by other players. You may start a game late into its life cycle, raising your skill floor and having to catch up with the other players who have been playing for the entire game's life cycle. These things can change how accessible a game is to a general audience, particularly the casual crowd. The launch of a multiplayer game is generally when the most people are engaged with the game, and when the skill floor and ceiling are at their lowest. People are still getting adjusted to the game's mechanics, and the full spectrum of what is possible has not been yet discovered. As a game continues to age, this cycle repeats itself. Experienced players get better and better, and the player base slowly bleeds active players until they die. Whether that be in 10 months or 10 years, this is the typical cycle of a multiplayer game. But over a long enough period of time, this is the fate of every game. Now, where does the issue arise with VR competitive? Wouldn't it follow the same cycle as any other game? The barrier to entry for competitive play is quite higher than typical flat-screen games. Not only do you have to own a VR headset and a PC for maximum performance, but you may have to invest in something like a gun stock depending on the game's given meta, and a large enough play area for your game. Not only do you have to dish out all this money, but you have to dish out your time learning how to be comfortable in VR before you can even begin to have a full understanding of a certain game. Getting good in VR is a skill on its own that can take hundreds if not thousands of hours to fully master, as at first it can be quite jarring jumping into VR for the first time. A lot of people who try VR never even try to get better at the skill of being in VR, sticking to more casual games like VR Chat, Rec Room, and other single-player experiences where they never have to challenge themselves to have a better understanding of how VR works. Not that that's something necessarily required for VR, but in terms of competitive play, this is where the issue starts to show itself. Having to learn a completely new way of using a device puts the people who have already mastered it over many years at a massive advantage before you even had the chance to play VR. It's like swapping from a controller to a keyboard and mouse and having to do catch up with everybody else that's already been using keyboard and mouse for many years now. Being good in VR is a skill that transfers across all games, and with so many of the top competitive games being similar like Pavlov, Breaches, Veil, and more, all you have to do as a competitive player is to learn the similar mechanics in another game over a few hundred hours. This is why we see a lot of the same teams and players dominating all of cross VR. They have mastered the skill of being in VR and will have a much easier time picking up a new game and learning its mechanics compared to someone who's just starting VR for the first time. Whenever a new competitive shooter comes out, you'll see a lot of the same people just switch over to the new game, see whether they like it or not, and make a decision to switch to playing that game if they determine it's worth their time. It's very rare you'll see a new player being able to keep up with everyone else, as it's already a massive grind to get good at VR in itself. Generally, you'll only see a handful of new players come to competitive from the new game, We can take Veil for example. On release, the top players of the game were already existing competitive players from games like Rec Room, Pavlov, Hyperdash, Contractors, Onward, and so on. It was only until they announced the massive Miami Major event did we see new players jump to the game and start grinding for a chance to compete. And even then, the players who actually made it to the LAN were already existing competitive players who have been in the space for years now. Even with that, the next issue these players will face is even finding the competitive community in certain VR games can be quite difficult. Most VR games do not have a ranked game mode, or even skill-based matchmaking. A lot of the comp community is tucked away deep within Discord servers that can be almost impossible to find without guidance of somebody else already in them, meaning they have to be passively introduced by a player within the game that is already within these communities. Without the challenging matches of ranked or skill-based matchmaking, it can take even more hours once you've achieved a reasonable amount of skill to even find someone in-game who is within the comp scene, let alone someone who's willing to help you. Regardless of the stereotype that VR is inherently more social, there is still antisocial behavior within the comp space, like any other competitive game, which adds to the already high entry barrier for comp. The issue isn't that these games are too hard to learn, or that VR is hard to learn. When it comes down to it, VR is still extremely niche. There are not many people in VR, let alone playing these shooter games regularly. There aren't really incentives for people to grind these games and get really good at them other than the love of it. And with that, there isn't really a reason for game developers to pour prize pools into these games, other than for the love of it. We've seen firsthand with Veil VR that going down the competitive route is not a viable way of generating revenue. Yes, the major did bring massive amounts of attention to competitive VR and the game that is still seen today. There's no denying that. But there's also no denying that it was not viable to continue these events regularly, as it is extremely costly to dish out prize pools, administration fees, renting out venues, flying out players, accommodation for players, along with everything else that has to be bought for the event itself. So, does competitive VR have a future? While we did have a massive surge of players during 2022 and 2021, those numbers won't be returning for a while now. VR as a technology is still quite expensive and is still a relatively small part of the tech market. And while the player base has been on a gradual incline over the past 4 years, we're still in the infancy of VR and what is truly possible within it. It's like the early days of PC gaming when everyone who was playing competitive Counter-Strike back in the early 2000s were only playing for their own enjoyment. There is still a long way to go until widespread adoption of VR is possible and competitive VR is viable to have massive LAN events regularly and thousands of dollars in prize pools. And thanks to the people and games who came before us, we know what's possible in the competitive space. But we'll have to sit patient for now. Enjoy these games and have fun playing them, but don't pour all of your time and effort into these games expecting a payoff for your hard work. So, does competitive VR have a future? I think so, but only time will tell. Thanks for watching.